It had been nearly a decade since Jason had left Hollowbrook, the small town nestled deep in the heart of rural America. He remembered it as a place where time seemed to stand still, a patchwork of cornfields, old barns, and creaking houses that had withstood the test of time, but not of change. The memories, though, weren't just nostalgic. There was a heaviness that clung to the town, like the air before a storm, and the longer he was away, the more he tried to forget what had happened here. But life had a way of dragging you back, whether you liked it or not. Jason's mother, Margaret, had passed away just a week ago. Her death wasn't unexpected. She'd been in poor health for years, but the fact that no one else in the family could take care of her childhood home meant Jason had to return. It was his responsibility now, even if the thought of stepping foot in Hollowbrook again made his skin crawl. The drive back was quiet, save for the soft hum of his tires on the lonely highway. It was late, the kind of hour when the world seems to sleep, leaving only the wind to whisper through the trees. The landscape rolled by in dark shadows, the small towns blurred together, until at last, Hollowbrook appeared like a forgotten relic on the horizon, its outline barely visible under the dim glow of a rising moon. Jason hadn't planned on staying long, just enough time to go through his mother's things and put the house up for sale. He never wanted to return to Hollowbrook, but there was no other choice. He had to do it for her. As his old truck rattled down the familiar, winding road, memories came rushing back. The old house at the end of the lane, the crooked picket fence, the rusted mailbox that always seemed to creak in the wind, even when there was no breeze. But there was something more. The whispers. Jason couldn't remember exactly when it started, whether it was before or after his father's death, but there were stories that floated around the town, stories that no one spoke of aloud, but everyone knew. People in town talked about the strange things that happened in the fields, about the disappearances that seemed to follow the harvest each year, and the more Jason tried to ignore it, the more he realized that something sinister was always lurking beneath the surface of the town's sleepy facade. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the thoughts. The past was the past, and he wasn't here to revisit it. The house stood at the end of the lane just like he remembered, its weathered exterior illuminated by the headlights of his truck. A wave of exhaustion hit him as he turned off the engine and stepped out into the cool night air. The familiar scent of earth and old wood filled his nostrils, but beneath it was something else, something sharp, like burnt metal. Jason brushed it off as nothing more than the weight of memories pressing down on him. Inside, the house was exactly as he'd left it, dusty, with the faint smell of mildew in the air. His mother's rocking chair sat in the corner of the living room, untouched, while framed pictures of long-dead relatives lined the walls. But something felt wrong. It was too quiet. He shrugged it off, telling himself that he was just tired. The trip had been long, and the house was old. Old houses made strange noises, especially at night. Still, something lingered in the back of his mind, an unease that made him feel like he wasn't entirely alone. He locked the door behind him and turned to face the dark hallways. As he started to walk toward the stairs, a sudden creaking sound echoed from above. Jason froze, listening. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Footsteps. Just the house settling. He muttered to himself, but deep down, he knew that wasn't what it was. The sound came again, louder this time. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Slowly, he turned and glanced toward the staircase. There was no one there, just the faint, shifting shadows that seemed to dance across the walls, cast by the pale light from the moon. But then, just as he began to convince himself it was nothing, he heard it. A whisper. A faint, rasping voice that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Jason, his name. He took a step back, his pulse quickening. His mouth went dry as he tried to steady himself. It couldn't be, could it? He hadn't heard that voice in years, not since. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jason spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The house was silent once more, but he wasn't alone. Somewhere, deep within the bowels of Hollowbrook, there was something waiting, something old, something that had never truly left, and now, it was watching him. This story seems to be getting scarier, doesn't it? If you want more stories like this, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. This helps create even more scary for you. The house seemed to close in on him, its silence pressing against his chest. Jason stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his mind racing as his eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could explain the unsettling feeling crawling down his spine. The whisper, the voice, sounded so familiar, so real, he couldn't shake the memory of it, even as the house seemed to settle back into its eerie quiet. He had to find out what was going on. Jason's hands were trembling as he reached for the door, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the doorknob. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but Jason felt an overwhelming compulsion to investigate further. No matter how much he told himself it was nothing, just his tired mind playing tricks on him, he knew something was wrong. He stepped out of the living room and into the dark hallway, his boots creaking on the worn wooden floor. The faint sound of footsteps still echoed in his mind, but there was no one in sight. He moved slowly toward the staircase, every step heavier than the last. Jason's eyes flickered toward the small doorway at the far end of the hall, the basement. It had always been locked when he was younger. His mother had told him to never go down there, that the basement was no place for a child. But now, it seemed to call to him, like a shadow lurking at the edge of his mind. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. He wasn't a kid anymore. He was a grown man, and whatever was in this house, whatever had made him feel like he wasn't alone, needed to be confronted. He could feel his pulse quicken as he walked toward the stairs, every part of him screaming to leave, to drive back into town and forget everything about Hollowbrook. But something kept him rooted to the spot. The soft creak of the floorboards echoed again. This time, the sound wasn't coming from upstairs. Jason's head snapped toward the basement door. It was open, just a crack. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't opened that door. A chill swept through him. He hadn't felt the presence of anyone, no footsteps behind him, no sudden movements in the shadows, but the door was unmistakably ajar. Without thinking, Jason walked toward it, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The air grew colder as he approached the stairs leading down into the basement, the darkness swallowing the space below. He swallowed hard, trying to muster the courage to go down. The door to the basement creaked as he pushed it open further. Jason paused, listening for any sounds from within. Nothing, just silence. He took a tentative step onto the first step, then another. The air grew damp, and the smell of earth and mildew hit him hard, the same scent that had lingered in the house since he was a child. But beneath that, there was something else, something sharp, like rotting wood or rusted metal. It made his stomach churn. Another step. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow as he descended, each one more oppressive than the last. The stairs creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoing loudly in the otherwise dead silence. At the bottom, the basement stretched out before him, full of old furniture covered in dusty sheets and long-forgotten boxes. Jason scanned the room, trying to steady his breathing. Everything looked just as he remembered, but there was something off. The air was thick with something he couldn't name. It wasn't just the smell, it was a weight, a heaviness in the room that made it difficult to breathe. His eyes fell on a corner of the basement where the shadows were especially thick. A large, old trunk sat there, half hidden under a tarp. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he realized he'd never seen that trunk before. He had to get closer. Something was drawing him to it, as if it had always been there, waiting for him. The moment he stepped closer, a loud bang echoed behind him. Jason whipped around, his body tensing, but there was nothing. The door to the basement had slammed shut, trapping him inside. He froze, his eyes locked on the door. The handle was jiggling, as if someone or something was trying to get in. The cold sweat that had been gathering on his forehead suddenly ran down his back. Jason's breath became shallow as he glanced around the room. His body was telling him to run, but his feet were glued to the floor. He couldn't look away from the corner where the trunk sat. The banging on the door grew louder, more frantic, and Jason felt a sharp twinge of panic in his chest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence again. Jason slowly turned back to the trunk. The shadows surrounding it seemed darker, deeper than before. He could feel his pulse thumping in his ears, his mind screaming at him to leave. But something kept him rooted to the spot. He reached out slowly, trembling as his fingers brushed the old fabric of the tarp. With a sharp breath, he pulled it away. What he saw made his stomach twist. The trunk wasn't filled with forgotten clothes or old relics. It was filled with something much more disturbing. The remnants of human bones, crushed and scattered like someone had been hastily digging. In the center of the pile, something glinted in the dim light, a small silver locket. Jason stepped back, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The locket, his mother's locket. He recognized it instantly. He had seen it in one of the old family photos when he was younger. But that didn't make sense. How could it be here? His head spun with questions, none of which made sense. Jason turned to run, but his foot caught on something. He stumbled, nearly crashing into a shelf of old jars. When he looked down, his heart nearly stopped. There, pressed against the floor, was a faded photograph. A picture of his mother. And on the back, written in delicate handwriting, was a single word: harvest. Jason's hands trembled as he picked up the photograph, his mind struggling to process what he had just found. The word harvest felt like a slap in the face, its meaning elusive but undeniably tied to something dark and ancient. The photo, now frayed at the edges, was of his mother, young, smiling, and standing beside a man he didn't recognize. They were standing in front of the very same barn on the outskirts of Hollowbrook, the one that had always stood like a sentinel on the edge of town, its structure rotting with age. But it wasn't the man in the photo that unsettled him, it was the way his mother looked. There was something in her eyes, something that said she knew things she never told him. His fingers gripped the edges of the photograph tightly, as if holding onto it could somehow answer the questions that had been swirling in his mind since he arrived. But the silence was deafening. The basement door, still locked, was an oppressive presence, its frame dimly illuminated by the faint light seeping through the cracks. Jason's breath was shallow as he tried to steady himself. He needed answers. Without another thought, he shoved the photograph into his pocket and moved toward the door. The banging had stopped, but he couldn't ignore the feeling of someone watching him from behind the walls. He threw his shoulder into the door, trying to break it open, but it wouldn't budge. Frustration surged, and he pushed harder, his muscles straining against the weight of the heavy wood. But then, just as quickly, the door gave way with a sharp crack. Jason stumbled backward, his heart racing. The door swung open with a creak, revealing the faint light of the hallway outside. He stepped into the hallway, breathing heavily, feeling like the air had just thickened around him. He could still hear the whispers, the same voice that had called out his name earlier echoing faintly in his head. But this time, it wasn't a voice from the house. It was coming from somewhere outside. Jason stood still, trying to make sense of it. The town itself was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that feels wrong, like the whole place was holding its breath. His gaze turned toward the back door of the house. He had to get out of here. He knew there were answers out there, answers he didn't want to find but couldn't ignore. The locket, the bones, the photograph, all of it pointed to something deeper, something buried in the past, hidden under layers of secrecy and fear. Jason grabbed his jacket and headed out the back door, stepping into the cold night air. The wind had picked up, the trees swaying in unnatural rhythm. The streets were empty, as if the town had been abandoned. No lights flickered in the windows of the nearby homes, no sounds of life, just the rustling of the trees in the distance. As he walked through the yard, his boots crunching on the frozen grass, he noticed something strange. The earth near the barn seemed disturbed, the ground uneven and freshly turned, as if something had been buried there recently. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He knew what he had to do. The barn, the place where everything started, where the town's dark history was tied to its very roots. He moved toward it slowly, the barn looming ahead like a specter. The closer he got, the more his instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he ignored them. He had already come this far. He had to see it for himself. The door to the barn creaked as he pulled it open, the smell of old hay and rotting wood filling the air. Inside, the shadows stretched long, moving with the flickering light of his flashlight. The barn had been abandoned for as long as Jason could remember. There were no animals, no crops, just a hollow shell of what it once was. But something had changed. At the far end of the barn, there was a large, wooden crate. It looked out of place, its edges scarred and splintered, like it had been dragged across the floor too many times. Jason's hand trembled as he approached it, his flashlight beam trembling along the cracked wood. He reached out, his fingers grazing the surface of the crate, but before he could open it, a voice echoed behind him. "You shouldn't be here." Jason spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The voice was low, ragged, and filled with the kind of terror that made his skin crawl. A man stood in the doorway of the barn. He was old, his face weathered by years of hard living, his eyes hollow and dark. There was something off about him, something that made Jason's blood run cold. "You don't belong here," the man repeated, his voice shaking with a strange mixture of fear and anger. Jason took a step back, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice unsteady. The man took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Jason. "I'm the one who tried to warn you. You don't understand. None of you do. The harvest, it's never over." Jason's mind raced. "The harvest? What are you talking about?" The old man's expression twisted with pain. "The harvest doesn't stop. It never stops. You should have never come back." He stepped forward again, his feet dragging across the dirt floor. "They'll come for you, too, just like they came for your father." Jason's blood ran cold. His father? His father had died years ago, long before he left Hollowbrook. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "They never leave. They come back, every year, and they take someone." Jason shook his head, trying to clear the fog that had descended over him. Who comes back?" The old man reached out, his bony hand grasping Jason's arm with surprising strength. "The land, boy, the land claims you. It always claims you." Jason's eyes widened in horror as the man's grip tightened. Suddenly, there was a loud cracking noise behind them. The barn door slammed shut with a force that sent dust swirling into the air. Jason turned, his breath hitching in his throat. The crate, once just an old, forgotten relic, was now open, and inside was a figure that looked hauntingly familiar. Jason's pulse raced as the figure slowly stood up, its movements jerky, unnatural. It was his father. But something was horribly wrong. His father's face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness. His lips moved, but the sound that escaped them wasn't his father's voice. It was the land's voice, and it was calling Jason's name. Jason stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the figure before him. His father, his dead father, stood at the far side of the barn, his body unnaturally still, yet somehow pulsing with an ominous energy. The air in the barn grew heavy, thick with something Jason couldn't quite name. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second, he wondered if he was dreaming, or if this was some kind of sick joke his mind had conjured up in its desperation. But then, his father's eyes flicked toward him, and they weren't his father's eyes. They were dark, hollow, like the void itself, and in that darkness, there was a presence, something ancient, something that had waited for years, the thing that had never truly left Hollowbrook. Jason stumbled back, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, this can't be. You're dead. You." The figure spoke, but the voice that came out was distorted, not his father's at all. It was deeper, rasping, almost like a growl from the earth itself. "It's your turn now, Jason." Jason felt his stomach drop. He couldn't breathe. The walls of the barn seemed to close in, and the shadows grew longer, darker. He tried to speak, to yell, to run, but his legs were frozen, as if the very ground beneath him had a hold on him, a grip that pulled him closer to the figure. "No," Jason gasped, his voice trembling. "I don't want this. I didn't come back for this." But the figure, his father, or whatever it had become, took another step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, its lips curled into something that could almost be mistaken for a smile, though it was far more menacing. "You have no choice," it rasped. "It's in your blood. You were always meant to come back. The harvest always takes one." Jason's heart hammered in his chest. He could barely think, could barely breathe. Everything inside him screamed to run, but his body refused to move. His legs were like lead, anchored to the barn floor by an invisible force. He looked toward the door, but it was too far away. There was no escape. The barn grew colder. The air seemed to thicken with each passing second. And then, Jason heard it, the sound that had been lurking in the back of his mind ever since he arrived. The whispering. It wasn't just a voice, it was a chorus, a low, growling murmur that seemed to rise from the very soil of the earth. The harvest, the land. Jason turned back to face his father's figure, his throat tightening. "What do you want from me? What is this?" The figure's voice was a hoarse rasp. "We take what is owed, and you're the next in line, just like your father before you." Jason's head spun. His father, the man who had vanished without a trace when Jason was a child, the man who had never been spoken of after his disappearance. No one ever talked about it in Hollowbrook, but now he knew why. His father hadn't simply left. He had been claimed by the harvest, taken by the land. Jason's pulse raced as realization crashed over him. His mother had tried to protect him, had tried to shield him from whatever dark force haunted Hollowbrook. She had hidden the truth, but it was right in front of him now. The harvest wasn't just a story, it was real, and it was coming for him. "Please," Jason choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want this, I can't." But the figure, his father's body, wasn't listening. It stepped forward again, closer this time, until Jason could see the decay in the man's face, the rotting flesh, the eyes that seemed to look through him, not at him. "Run," the figure whispered. "Run if you can, but it's too late." Jason felt the ground beneath him shift. The barn creaked, groaned, as though the very foundation was alive. And suddenly, it was as if the earth itself was pulling at his feet, tugging at his legs. The harvest had begun. Jason's instincts took over. He couldn't wait any longer. He turned, forced himself to move, his legs finally responding as he sprinted toward the barn door. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurred with panic. But when he reached the door, it wouldn't open. His hands were shaking as he twisted the handle, yanked at the door with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the barn itself was holding him in. Behind him, the figure moved. The rasping growl was growing louder, closer, its footsteps uneven but relentless. Jason turned in desperation, his heart pounding. He had to get out, he had to escape. And then he saw it, a small, forgotten window high up on the barn wall. It was his only chance. Without thinking, he ran toward the wall, jumping onto an old stack of crates and pulling himself up. His fingers scraped against the rough wood as he hoisted himself through the small window opening. The moment he fell outside, he felt the grip of the earth release him, but the ground was still shaking, as if the land was angry, disturbed by his escape. He hit the ground hard, rolling as he landed, and scrambled to his feet, his heart still racing. The cold wind cut through him, but he didn't stop. He ran. He ran through the fields, past the old barn, past the house, the very ground beneath him trembling, as if the land itself was trying to drag him back. Jason's legs burned as he ran faster, pushing his body to its limits, but he could still hear it, the whispering. The harvest had not finished. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. In the distance, he saw the outline of the town. It seemed so far away, a place that had always been his home but now felt more like a distant memory, a place he could never return to. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself forward, toward the edge of town, toward the road that would lead him away. But no matter how far he ran, he knew one thing was certain. The harvest was an unbroken cycle, and it would come again next year, and the year after that. It always came, it always took. And next time, it might take him. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts on this terrifying story, and subscribe for more spine-chilling horror tales.